what we see now in this post-Dobbs era is the gaslighting of telling women that these things really don't matter. Oh, you're safe and healthy when you're really not safe and healthy. There are many different reasons why someone might need to terminate a pregnancy, including in order to save a life. Dobbs has unleashed this chaos and riptide effect, and it's women who've been caught in this riptide and girls.
Welcome to episode 256 of the Refuse-Fascism podcast, a podcast brought to you by volunteers with Refuse-Fascism. This is Sam Goldman, one of those volunteers and host of the show. Refuse-Fascism works to unite all who can be united, to join in mass nonviolent resistance in the streets and throughout society, growing to include millions and refusing to stop until we create such a profound political crisis that Trump cannot impose his fascist terror, cannot govern, or even maintain his hold on power. Big thanks to our patrons, everyone who rates, reviews, shares the show, and reps our merch. Please know that every bit helps connect more people with Refuse-Fascism. Today, we'll be sharing an interview with Dr. Michele Goodwin, along with a deeply insightful speech by Reverend William Lamar IV at our July 3rd Speak Out that Refuse-Fascism hosted outside the National Museum of African American History and Culture in DC. But first, let's talk about this past week, covering some major themes. The fascist program unfolding before our eyes, the deep and dramatic changes in the very structure of law enforcement that are being ushered in today, the expanding lawlessness of the regime, and that now is the moment to act and wrench out a different future. In Los Angeles, Trump's troops raided MacArthur Park in Los Angeles, the heart of a vibrant immigrant community. Dozens of federal agents in full tactical gear, accompanied by members of the National Guard and Marines. Some traversed the park on horseback, fully reminiscent of the slave catchers they politically descend from. Across Southern California, they raided farms, workplaces, and even invaded a surgical clinic. In addition to rounding up and disappearing hundreds of human beings, one man, Jaime Alanis Garcia, was murdered in a raid on the farm where he worked in Southern California. Repeatedly, these ICE Gestapo enforcers and their military and law enforcement co-conspirators faced the righteous anger and courageous action of decent people refusing to accept Trump's fascist America. Now is the time for mass noncompliance, mass refusal, mass non-cooperation, when the order of the day is fascist rule. On Thursday, July 10th, Trump's Gestapo, in a military-style operation, carried out a grotesque raid on a farm in Camarillo, California. Kids running from tear gas, kids crying into their phones as their mothers were taken from the fields. Over 300 arrested. The wife and sister of a U.S. citizen, a veteran, arrested during the raid, crying into the news camera the next day, begging to know the whereabouts of their loved one. But I want to talk about the righteous resistance that Trump's Gestapo faced, something that was not seen in the early days of Nazi Germany as people began being disappeared. Thanks to rapid response networks, family members and concerned community members were quick on to the scene. Hundreds blocked routes, dozens intercepted parts of the convoy. People literally put their bodies on the line to stop Trump's Gestapo's convoys again and again and again. They impeded vehicles. They withstood tear gas and less than lethal rounds, and they slowed the whole process. This must grow now. Thousands of us need to be there every time Trump's Gestapo shows its face. Every day, LA continues to be occupied by a military force. Be there making their job impossible and demanding the Trump fascist regime must go now, because that is the only conscionable reaction to your government kidnapping and disappearing people. That is the only conscionable response to a massive policing machine for fascist rule, one that surpasses any domestic police force in U.S. history and one that rivals militaries of other countries. Because it is the only conscionable reaction when we know the lessons of Nazi Germany, of Mussolini's Italy, of Pinochet's Chile. Because we must act before all the avenues for redress are cut off, before all those on the side of justice are locked up or silenced or have adjusted to these atrocities. Because this is the power they are forging to surveil, detain, and disappear anyone the regime labels as a threat. Because they, the fascists, are not all powerful, and we, the people, are not powerless. Just consider Trump's response, greenlighting ICE to use any means necessary and giving quote-unquote complete authorization for ICE to respond to such protests, however they need, as a signal that this resistance presents a real challenge to them. The lesson? We must not relent. We need to grow in size and determination, and with the demand that this fascist regime must go now. It is in that spirit that Refuse-Fascism is calling for nonviolent action July 26th through July 28th, demanding shut down ICE, no military occupation, shut down the whole Trump fascist regime. Trump must go now. We are in a state of emergency. There can be no business as usual when that business is cementing fascist rule. So be sure to stay tuned to refusefascism.org and our social media platforms at Refuse-Fascism for more. As these goons from DHS brutalize people, the monsters across the rest of the regime used other methods to carry out their cruelty. Trump's Department of Health and Human Services released rules to deny access to education to the poorest undocumented children, those enrolling in Head Start early education programs. Trump's Justice Department subpoenaed 20 health professionals who provide gender-affirming care to trans youth, claiming to be investigating fraud, but clearly acting to intimidate those who dare to provide care to people whose very existence flies in the face of this fascism. In Texas, over 100 people are dead, with even more still missing and presumed dead. The New York Times has detailed how cuts at the National Weather Service led directly to warning systems being compromised. But a wider view shows how pernicious fascist ideology, which refuses to recognize the concept of the common good, which denies science and the very endeavor of human knowledge, which openly subordinates people's very lives to short-term profit, left people in one of the most dangerous floodplains in America, vulnerable to precisely the catastrophe that had been long predicted before unfolding this week. The response to the devastation has been tragic in its own right. Cuts to FEMA imposed by the regime meant thousands of calls from survivors were left unanswered for days. Teams from around the country that have historically been dispatched within hours of natural disasters did not receive orders for days on end. On the ground in Texas, a full week after the floods hit, Trump claimed that after coming into office in January, his people fixed FEMA, quote unquote, in no time. This is just the latest and possibly most reality-averse iteration of claims by Trump and Kristi Noem that they are fundamentally restructuring or even eliminating FEMA altogether. The fascist logic is that, regardless of facts or logic, everything bad is the fault of their enemies and anything good is their doing, and that must be their reality, especially in a case like this, where the exact opposite is true. So let's look closer at the ballooning budget of Trump's ethnic cleansing through mass incarceration and mass deportation machine, and the qualitative transformation of law enforcement it is helping to usher in. In Trump's big, ugly fascist bill, $170 billion is earmarked for Trump's immigration agenda. As part of this, ICE's budget has more than tripled, with the goal of 10,000 new agents, giving ICE more personnel than the entire FBI. Immigrant detention facilities, what can only be described as concentration camps, will double their capacity, with a budget larger than the Federal Bureau of Prisons. This will not simply result in more of the same, but together with Trump's stated goals, will deeply shift the relationship between people living in the United States and their government. We are already seeing small glimpses of that future. Neighborhoods invaded with military formations fanning out, profiling and seizing brown people or anyone who they deem suspicious. ICE agents illegally seizing anyone they deem a threat, anyone who protests their cruelty or even questions their authority. A massive concentration camp of steel cages erected in mere weeks and already filled near capacity in the heart of a swamp directly in the path of Hurricane Alley. Federal agents arresting the mayor of Newark, threatening to arrest the mayor of Los Angeles, threatening to denaturalize and deport the highly favored candidate for mayor of New York City. The Department of Homeland Security issuing guidance to police that entirely innocent and totally protected activities like skateboarding and live streaming at protests are violent tactics. Integral in all this is blurring the lines between state, federal, and local authority, with Trump's seizure of California's National Guard, with DeSantis's gift of alligator Auschwitz, and Trump's threat to literally take over Democrat-run cities, and altogether erasing the already fuzzy line between military and police. So far, we've seen particular instances of all of them. These are new tactics being tried out, set apart from what has been standard operating procedure by both their next-level cruelty and their sheer scalability. The bill also allocates significant resources for quote-unquote information technology investments in pursuit of Trump's promised ethnic cleansing. Much of this money will go to Palantir, whose founder has taken out ads across the country calling for the defense of quote-unquote Western, read white, civilization, and whose billionaire chairman is largely behind the elevation of J.D. Vance. This firm is expected to integrate AI into both surveillance and capture of those the regime deems undesirable. In this, Grok's recent transformation into Mecha Hitler should give us all pause. In case you missed it, the AI bot, which Elon Musk integrated into Twitter named Grok, recently used widely available data to come to the true conclusion that Trump and Musk are largely to blame for the deaths in the Texas floods. Elon then modified the bot to stop such quote-unquote woke nonsense, and it immediately began churning out explicit praise for Adolf Hitler, casual references to Jews wrecking America and the world. AI-fueled apocalypse doesn't have to wait for sentience or the singularity. Similarly to what we've seen through much of Trump's reign, terror and devastation doesn't have to be at the hands of evil geniuses. It can and likely will be much stupider than anticipated. With open Western chauvinists at their helm, it's worth thinking about how Palantir's targets will be chosen, what prompts will define priorities, what forms of dehumanization will feed back and forth between the MAGA fascists and the machines built to reinforce and weaponize their inhumane beliefs. Meanwhile, as resources are being funneled into so-called immigration enforcement, with ICE showing their clear fealty to Trump and his agenda, we've seen substantial purges continuing throughout much of the rest of the federal law enforcement apparatus to expand that blind loyalty. Investigations have now been opened into former CIA head John Brennan and former FBI director James Comey, who both enabled Trump and many policies which he has seized on, as clear warnings against even just doing your job, let alone constitutionally protected criticism of the regime. This week, we learned that senior FBI agents have been asked to undergo polygraph tests to determine whether they have spoken ill of the new FBI chief and diehard Trump loyalist Kash Patel. Running alongside this surge in so-called law enforcement is the ever-expanding, utter lawlessness of MAGA rule, working off the legal foundation that the fascist-stacked Supreme Court has granted Trump through last year's immunity ruling. And this past month's injunction ban, we are witnessing the federal government's direct defiance of the law and the wholesale destruction of any legal forms of redress. It's maybe most blatant in Trump's stance on birthright citizenship, directly contradicting the letter and spirit of the 14th Amendment, but it's much more widespread. After multiple rounds of resignations and firings among federal prosecutors stemming from refusal to go along with Trump and Bondi's illegal and unethical orders, we now have a whistleblower providing evidence that Emil Bove, a top Justice Department official and former personal lawyer for Trump, was issuing express orders to his subordinates to ignore and defy judicial rulings. It came out this week that El Salvador, as per its agreement with the U.S., has expressed to the UN that they have no jurisdiction over the prisoners Trump sent to El Salvador's torture prison, CICOT. This means that the Justice Department has been consistently and blatantly lying to the courts in numerous cases regarding returning those men, most famously in the case of Kilmar Abrego Garcia. The same day that a federal judge ordered to stop ICE's illegal actions in Southern California, such as raids lacking probable cause and open racial profiling, Trump posted on Truth Social that he is giving, quote-unquote, total authorization to ICE to do whatever they like to citizens protesting their actions, even as the law is clear that they have no authority over U.S. citizens. Mario Guerrera, a Salvadorian journalist who has legally lived and worked in the U.S. for decades, was arrested for covering a No Kings protests in Georgia. After being shuffled between local and federal detention facilities, he is still being held by ICE, a full week after one of their own so-called immigration judges ordered him released on bail. And now, to make clear exactly where they stand, Trump is openly threatening to strip a U.S.-born white woman of her U.S. citizenship explicitly because he doesn't like her, explicitly because she challenges him. It may be easy to laugh at this threat against Rosie O'Donnell, as his long-standing vitriol towards her is so particularly petty. But once you remove the veil of American exceptionalism, it's clear to see. All evidence shows that this threat is deadly serious. The fascists believe they are the law, and they are systematically seizing the levers of power to make that nightmare a reality. It is important to note the ire which Trump is lashing out at political opponents, whether it be Rosie or the protesters in the streets of Southern California, because from the fascist standpoint, backing down from the fights that they have started is impossible. They do not believe in off-ramps. But even as they can't back down, they are not all powerful, and they have not completely consolidated power. Not yet. It's wild that everything I've discussed above has been done without instituting martial law nationwide or fully invoking the Insurrection Act. And since Trump has returned to power, they have not felt the need to unleash their rabid mobs and fascist paramilitary forces. But this is an untenable situation on multiple levels. There is still opportunity to act in our millions to derail this fascist juggernaut, but we must act now. This is an emergency situation. It's extraordinary that people in Southern California are continuing to show up with courageous, often relatively spontaneous action in defense of their neighbors, but it's also true that many social movements tend to wither without a clear path to victory. The demand that Trump must go now must take hold and fast. Meanwhile, in the history of global fascism, there comes a time where it's too late to stop the fascists from within. That time seems to be coming sooner rather than later, but it has not arrived yet. Again, now is the time to act. Without rival global powers positioned to keep them in check, the main thing holding them back, them being the fascists, from crossing that Rubicon is fear of what you and the tens of millions of decent people in this country might do if they go too far, too fast in a way that compels people into action. They are not in total control of when or whether that may happen. The logic of fascism has compelled them into rough waters more than once already in relatively small ways. There should be no doubt that it will happen again in one form or another. Our actions today, yes, today, literally today, particularly in centering the righteous and obtainable demand that the Trump fascist regime must go now, can affect or even determine the outcome of such situations continue to develop. We cannot allow the targets of this regime to be isolated. We cannot demand they fight when no one will fight by their side. There is a long history of oppressed people in this country fighting heroically for their freedom, even as they are wildly outgunned and often outnumbered. But one key ingredient we've seen take shape in particularly evil times, in small ways during the full-scale campaign of extermination against Indigenous people in the early 1800s, in the Northern Territories of the Confederacy during the Civil War, during the resurgence of the Klan in the 1920s, during the Freedom Rides of the 1960s. We saw these reactionary forces impeded and sometimes fractured by even small numbers of white people losing their loyalty to whiteness, standing to fight against the very tyranny that they themselves often benefited from. We are seeing some of this today, especially across Southern California, but not only. This phenomena has existed in these moments throughout American history, but now we need to reach unprecedented levels amongst white folks and amongst anyone who isn't directly in the fascist crosshairs at any given moment. In a major New York Times Magazine article, How Trump Upended 60 Years of Civil Rights in 2 Months, journalist and creator of the 1619 Project, Nikole Hannah-Jones, exposed a sweeping rollback of federal civil rights protections, one that she warned may bring about a new era of unchecked discrimination. Hannah-Jones details how Trump's assault on civil rights reaches every part of the federal government, leaving discrimination against Black people, Latinos, women, and LGBTQ people to go unchallenged. What she describes is nothing short of a full-on assault, one that leaves discrimination against Black folks, Latinos, women, and LGBTQ folks completely unpunished. No part of the federal government is being spared. Housing, healthcare, employment, education, policing. It's all being stripped of protection. And it's not just about what people can't access. It's about what we're allowed to know. While these rights are being gutted, the history of Black people and other oppressed peoples is being wiped out from classrooms and textbooks, from libraries, and even the plaques on national monuments. This isn't just rollback, it's erasure. On July 3rd, as part of Refuse-Fascism's 4-day of action in D.C., leading up to declaring our independence from Trump's fascist America in the name of humanity, on July 4th, we hosted a speak out right outside the Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture. We joined with people from across the country to speak out against the erasure of Black history and the MAGA indoctrination sweeping much of the nation. Reverend Lamar IV gave this incisive speech.
Good morning, brothers and sisters, comrades. Good morning, each and every one of you. It is a pleasure to be with you. Let me first begin by saying that I am honored to stand here in the tradition of justice, to stand here in the tradition of those of us who believe that democracy has never taken root in this place, and that it is for us to ensure that democracy can grow and thrive and to be a part of the generations of brothers and sisters who have revolted against American fascism, against American white supremacy, against oligarchy, plutocracy, and a new word I have learned, kakistocracy. That means government by idiots. I serve a church. Let me share with you, there are many Christianities. I serve a church in the Black prophetic tradition. What does that mean? That means that we believe that every human being is a child of God. That means that we believe that every human being should eat, every human being should be safe, every human being should have shelter and education. And we believe in a nation like the United States that is more than possible. The sucking sound that you hear right now and that we have heard since the founding of this nation is money being extracted from poor people and given to the wealthy. What you hear right now in Congress with this ugly bill is the exact same thing. We are a church who fights. You're looking at someone who serves a congregation that now owns the Proud Boys' intellectual property. We own their trademark because we believe in fighting. We do not believe in watching what we see. We believe in building what is possible. And I want you all to know that we are in the city of Carter G. Woodson, who is called the father of Black history, who was clear that from the very beginning, those in power want to erase the stories of those whom they would dehumanize. They want to erase the stories of those who they wish to subjugate, those whom they wish to exploit and oppress. But this stands as a monument to those of African descent who have been revolting since the first encounter with those who would take them from their land and bring them here as enslaved people. What you don't read about is a number of enslaved people who fought and revolted on ships on the way here. What you don't read about is the New Orleans slave revolt, where those who were enslaved rose up in the most brutal kind of slavery to destroy those sugar plantation owners. You don't hear about Nat Turner and what he was able to do. Why do we celebrate Washington here, who took up arms against Britain, and not celebrate Nat Turner, who took up arms against those who enslaved his physicality? It is because they want to give us their heroes. But George Washington is not my hero, whose wealth is built on enslaved people and who wrote words he did not intend to live. Nat Turner is my hero. Sojourner Truth is my hero. Harriet Tubman is my hero. Cesar Chavez is my hero. Dorothy Day is my hero. Harvey Milk is my hero. Those human beings who believe that together we could build a space where we all thrive. We are here today to tell the truth about the history of African people in America, but about the history of us all. And that history is not just to be read, but it is to be used as fuel to motivate us to tear down systems of fascism and injustice and to build the kind of place where we can all live together. Trump must go. Trump must go. Trump must go. Trump must go. And finally, there are so many people who do what I do, who support Donald Trump's regime. I don't want to be clear with you that there can be no one who stands behind a desk in the name of one who was executed by the state, lifting up the executioner. We are on the side not of the executioner, but of those whom they seek to execute, those whom they seek to destroy. Trump is on the wrong side of history. Trump is on the wrong side of God. Trump is on the wrong side of divinity. Trump must go. Now. Trump must go. Now. Trump must go. Now. Thank you.
This Thursday, July 17th, we call on everyone to join Good Trouble Lives On Actions and raise the demand Trump must go now. Refuse-Fascism's flagship protest will take place in LA at 5 p.m. at the Federal Building. Join a human installation of the disappeared. For more information on this action and to find a protest near you, visit refusefascism.org. We are now 3 years post-Dobbs, and the reality unfolding is that to be pregnant in a state with an abortion ban, even if it isn't an outright total abortion ban, is to risk your life. This is especially true for Black women, paired with a movement of hyenas that are now in power, threatening women and girls everywhere in word and deed with "your body, my choice." A temporary injunction is in place preventing the defunding of Planned Parenthood as part of Trump's big fascist bill. But let's be clear, its outcome is perilous in a court system where the higher up you go, the more it has become an instrument for fascist rule. If this is able to take hold, the defunding of Planned Parenthood, 1 in 4 of all abortion providers in the U.S. could soon close, leaving abortion legal but almost impossible to access, at least in clinical settings in many states. As Jessica Valenti has accurately called, the so-called big, beautiful bill is actually, quote, Republicans' big, beautiful backdoor ban on abortion, end quote. To dig into what the fall of Roe has meant, not just for abortion access, but for the broader landscape of human rights and fascism in America, I spoke with Dr. Michele Goodwin. In a conversation we recorded earlier this week, we talked about the post-Roe reality, the increasing criminalization of people seeking care and providing care, the increasing criminalization of people for their pregnancy outcomes, and why we must understand this as part of a broader consolidation of power. Since this interview was recorded, we learned of another woman arrested for her pregnancy outcome, this time in South Carolina. As our call to conscience, our call to act states, quote, "Now is the time for women and LGBTQ people who are furious at being enslaved in a race to bring their defiance and rage into the public square, along with all who refuse to accept their future," end quote. It is a profound honor to welcome Professor Michele Goodwin, the president of the Law and Society Association. She's the author of the award-winning book, Policing the Womb, Invisible Women and the Criminalization of Motherhood. She is the Linda D. and Timothy J. O'Neill Professor of Constitutional Law and Global Health Policy at Georgetown University. If you haven't read Policing the Womb, you may know Professor Goodwin as the host of On the Issues with Michele Goodwin, or from her voluminous commentary. And it is so wonderful to have you with us, Dr. Goodwin. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And I have to say that I should update my bio. I am the immediate past president of the Law and Society Association, but we're only off by a few weeks because it's not like that was a year ago. That was just a few weeks ago. But I thank you for that very warm and generous introduction. And thank you so much for inviting me on your show.
I want to start our conversation with having you tell our listeners about the case of Adriana Smith and what that experience tells us about post-Roe America and the new Jane Crow.
Adriana Smith is a brain dead, and I pause on this because Adriana Smith died. She was brain dead, which is the medical and legal standard that's been used for more than half a century in the United States in recognizing death. She was brain dead, and her body was forced into a state of human incubation, of gestation. She had been pregnant before dying very early in her pregnancy. I think it's worth noting that she sought medical care, and there's the perception by family members that she didn't get the health care that she deserved and needed. I will say that that's part of a legacy in the United States about unequal health treatment that Black women experience in a variety of ways. It's been well documented and written about over decades. At any rate, she succumbed to what was likely preventable, is my understanding, and became brain dead. And because the state has a very strong anti-abortion law, it was interpreted that that law would have prevented the hospital from simply allowing her body to take its natural state in death and then provide it to her mother. And that didn't happen. And so her mother, Miss Newkirk, made television appearances. She was interviewed, and she talked about how she was, as a mother, denied the choice of being able to allow her daughter to rest in peace. And if I could, Sam, I want to add one additional point or two to this. That one, at the point in which Adriana experienced, her body experienced a forced C-section, and at the point in which then she was taken off of these machines at a Georgia hospital, she had been in that state. Her body had been in that state for more than 100 days. Now, that relates to the next thing that is important to say, which is that dating back centuries has been this notion embedded in law that there should never be the desecration of a dead body. There's something that is seen as being sacred in that way. And here we don't have to look back at the Romans, right? Or people from Greece a millennia ago. In the United States, in England, dating back centuries, is this notion you don't desecrate the dead. And it's interesting to think about a prosecution against Brittany Watts just a year ago, as she had a miscarriage at home, and law enforcement sought to prosecute her for desecrating a corpse. So here you have on one end a woman who's gone to the hospital several times in pain, near death, experiencing a miscarriage, and at home has that miscarriage, the body involuntarily expelling what's in the uterus, the fetus. And police break into her home, come into her home, bust open her toilet, searching for fecal and fetal remains, the police do. And the argument used in prosecution against her is she's desecrated a corpse. And on the other hand, just a few states away in Georgia is this active desecration of Andriana. I'll wrap up with saying this. It has been long understood for centuries of jurisprudence and law that when there is desecration of a corpse, desecration of what was a living body, that it affects the family, that there is trauma that is imposed on the family, that they suffer and that society suffers from it.
Thank you for walking us through that. I think that this through line of the inhumanity of it, that, in both examples, the women were not seen as the people that they are. In the case of Ms. Smith, her mother wasn't seen as the person she is, the living, breathing person of agency that was able to decide what she knew was best for her daughter. I think that just heartbreakingly consistent across all these stories, whether it be women who are long been no longer with us, who are kept going for this fetus, or the women who are charged for miscarriages or bleeding out, all of whom their humanity is completely expendable.
That's right. This is the tragedy of what we're experiencing, the reverberation, the pushback, this long arc towards justice that really became visible, palpable, being seen through that arc of litigation, most seen associated with Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, but she was able to build on the platform of Pauli Murray. But those important cases, laws, over 600 laws during the time of her litigation with the ACLU, gender-based discrimination being struck down. 1973, Roe v. Wade, 7-2 decision, 5 of those 7 justices Republican appointed. Justice Blackmun writes the opinion in Roe. He's put on the court by Richard Nixon. So we see this effort to recognize the humanity and dignity of women that's taking shape in the 1970s, further being solidified in the 1980s, and building from that, women finally able to take seats at tables where they had long deserved to be, whether it be in the halls of Congress, making their way in the judiciary, district court judges, appellate court judges, finally with Justice O'Connor making her way, Justice Sandra Day O'Connor making her way to the United States Supreme Court. All of that, and then what we see now in this post-Dobbs era is the chip away, slap away, slap away. The gaslighting of telling women that these things really don't matter. Oh, you're safe and healthy when you're really not safe and healthy. Telling women that, oh, it's important that you're denied this health care because you don't really need it. You'll be healthier without this health care. And at the same time, medical studies that have even been acknowledged by the Supreme Court informing us that a woman is 14 times more likely to die carrying a pregnancy to term in the United States than by having an abortion. And so, as you're speaking about this space on which Dobbs has unleashed this chaos and riptide effect, and it's women who've been caught in this riptide and girls, not enough attention has been placed on the fact that these laws, they don't build out exceptions for the little ones. And I can tell you that in my research, and in meeting with doctors, meeting with prosecutors too. But I can tell you that in the wake of Dobbs, as there have been physicians in states like Louisiana who multiple times have appealed to the legislature saying, we've had an 8-year-old, 9-year-olds coming before us, having been raped and pregnant. Do you understand how traumatic this will be for those children to become mothers at 8 if they survive? Or maybe they survive, but they're injured for the rest of their lives. Their body completely changes, and only for lawmakers in Georgia then to put forward bills that fortunately have not passed yet, but have had signatures saying, well, we should impose the death penalty against any women or girls or medical providers who terminate pregnancies. There should be no exceptions for rape or incest. I mean, it's that level of barbarism. And we're in a space that a decade ago, these would have been bridges too far. A decade ago, the very idea that there would have been a lawmaker who would have others signing on to legislation saying, well, let's just kill them. Let's kill the little girls and let's kill the women. I mean, a decade ago, the very idea that in Idaho, women would have to be helicoptered out of the state in order to save their lives, people would have said, of course not. That's not going to happen. But how quickly, how swiftly. And aren't there lessons for us in all of that? I mean, the title of your podcast is Refuse-Fascism. Look at how quickly these changes have taken shape.
There's the speed and there's the veracity of it. And there's also the how quickly the atrocity becomes normalized. And part of it is, as you were indicating, is they keep upping the ante. They keep escalating. We're just trying to catch our breath and they continue the assault. And I think that it's stunning and it's hard to see how far they've gone. Dobbs very directly made women and all those with the capacity to give birth into second-class citizens with their bodies subordinate to potential or even, as you've indicated, even hypothetical fetuses. At one point, this would have been unfathomable, and now it is what exists in over half the country.
Oh, no, that's absolutely right. So, what does exist and the rapidity? So, what exists now is that we have little girls who are going into middle school as mothers or have had to flee state. We have women being helicoptered out of states, driving out of states, fearful that their license plates will be tracked, fearful of criminal prosecution, fearful of communicating with loved ones. So let's be clear about what this represents from the start. In the term in which Dobbs was announced, at the beginning of that term, the Supreme Court weighed in on Texas's SB 8 law, which weaponizes citizenry to go after individuals that they believe have aided or abetted someone in terminating a pregnancy. Now, that's straight out of a page from the Fugitive Slave Act, where citizens were incentivized to go and find people that they believe had escaped slavery and those who had aided and abetted those who had escaped. I had actually mentioned that. I was actually writing an op-ed for a publication that I did a lot of writing for prior to Dobbs. And I sent it to my editor who would often greenlight. And he wrote back, he said, well, this just sounds like some lefty stuff and you need to send this someplace else. But of course, what was revealed was exactly that. He was not paying attention to what was coming. And I saw this in its connection to its historical roots and foundations. And that is, in fact, where we are. This sense of weaponizing people such that it means that people who are suffering can't communicate to others. So imagine the 11-year-old who's become pregnant, who then has to worry that if I tell my teacher, if I tell my mother, if I tell my aunt, they could get in trouble. So I better keep this to myself, what this condition I believe that I'm in, and who put me in this condition, because I don't want them to get in trouble if they try to help me. This from a country where the very first amendment to the Constitution is one that grants the freedom of speech, the freedom of association, the freedom of assembly. and that being eroded. And you spoke to how rapid these things can happen. Well, Sam, something that has been in my mind for some time is what happens to a people when it starts on one day that they're bidding on people. They raise a billet and they say, $5, $10. And then it goes on not just for a day, they get a taste for it, such that it happens another day, and such that it happens for a week, and then they really get a taste for it. Let's try this for a month. They really get a taste for it, and let's try it for a year. And those years flow into decades and into centuries. So in some ways, Sam, we have practiced this in this country. We've practiced this sense of dehumanization against others. We are a nation where so many of us love the soil on which we garden, the soil in which our loved ones came to, whether by force or voluntarily leaving someplace else. And we have relatives who have then fought for the maintenance of this country's security or others around the world. But at the same time, this is a nation that did practice slavery for centuries. This is a nation that did have Jim Crow. This is a nation that did reject Jewish people as they were suffering and experiencing genocide abroad and said, we don't have doors open for you. This is a nation where there was the Trail of Tears. This is a nation wherein there was coercive sterilization against white people. Tens of thousands of them coercively sterilized between the 1910s and the 1940s with this idea that somehow we could weed out poor white people from the United States. Being able to hold space with the complexity of who we've been as a culture, as a society within law is important.
Very, very essential to understand, I think, where this comes from, where this the violent reassertion of patriarchy, of xenophobia, of white supremacy comes from. It exists within this culture. All fascisms do. And I think that we've seen kind of the green light within the legal apparatus for the legacy of Dobbs to just now steamroll through, with more peoples being dehumanized, being fully human in one state but not another, just expand. I feel like maybe the same could be seen for the bans on trans healthcare or even this ridiculous unconstitutional birthright citizenship.
Yes. Notice this, that the Scrimetti decision, wherein the Supreme Court upheld a Tennessee law that bans gender-affirming care for trans youth, but not for all youth. The Supreme Court this term heard a case out of Tennessee, one of about 19 states, that in the last 3 years, not something dating back 20 years, 50 years, 70 years, just within the last few years since Dobbs, passing law saying no gender affirming care for trans kids. This would all, of course, be very different if the state said, it says it worries about health care. Well, then why have gender affirming care for any kids? You just say, we ban gender affirming care for all kids. But the state didn't do that. It wrote a law that explicitly on its face singled out trans kids. Now, there's a lot of confusion about this because you have people who are saying, well, children just shouldn't receive gender affirming care. This is just wrong. Well, then altogether, then the Tennessee legislature needs to go back and say no more gender affirming care for the boy who doesn't feel masculine enough, who uses gender affirming care. So people actually have this quite wrong. Gender affirming care has been used for quite some time. So the boys who have not gotten to puberty yet, or whose father may feel that, my boy needs more muscles, he's not looking what I associate with manly enough. Well, guess what? Those kids in Tennessee today can get gender affirming care, and their parents can go to the pediatrician and say, I want my boy bulked up. My daughter is not developing yet. We think that she should be more developed. And she can get that gender affirming care or get some care that suppresses that. If she happens to be an athlete, and it turns out that reaching puberty complicates the athleticism and the ability to be able to perform as a gymnast, as a runner, etc., then that child and her parents can go in Tennessee to a pediatrician or another physician and get that care that then suppresses puberty. What we have seen is, on one hand, this articulation that We are a nation that's moving towards recognizing people's individuality and their autonomy and their free speech and so forth, and that the First Amendment is really so important. And yet, at the other hand, and I think why people are saying that they feel like there's the gaslighting is because it seems that, well, for whole categories of people, they're not able to access these civil liberties and these civil rights as other people.
One of the cases that I feel this term hasn't been talked, I guess, as much about is the Medina versus Planned Parenthood and the upholding of the South Carolina order that strips Medicaid funding from, I know it's not specifically Planned Parenthood, but it is targeting them, and then kind of was seen as a really great news to those who wanted to see that component of the budget bill go through to further that. I just wanted to get your thoughts on, we're told that this court makes so many of their decisions because of originalism, and what's the story there?
There's a real tragedy that is associated with the Medina case and ways that deserve better understanding. One of the achievements of President Johnson was, in fact, the advancement of Medicaid for Americans and, more broadly, attention to reducing the impact and efforts to eliminate racism in healthcare. There was actually a medical civil rights movement. And in that medical civil rights movement, there were mostly Black doctors, but there were some others that joined and recognized that there was considerable discrimination in American healthcare. And there was, and there had been. There have been Black patients in the South who died on the front steps of hospitals that were staffed by white people who would not take them in, literally dying on the front steps. Many people don't know that one of the reasons why Sammy Davis Jr., the famous musician and tap dancer who was one of the Rat Pack, was in an accident and lost his eye, but would have been an even worse situation. Part of that was that the night that that happened, he knew where he would not be able to get health care. And so he suffered. And people don't know that it was Frank Sinatra who set up a medical team at his house in California for 6 months for Sammy Davis Jr. to get medical attention and to be rehabilitated, because that was the status of healthcare in the United States for Black people, such that even if you were famous and on television and in movies, it did not mean that in the United States you would be treated with dignity going to a healthcare facility. So, as a backdrop to that case, it's important to understand that this is actually part of the legacy of Johnson moving forward, pushing forward to advance healthcare dignity in this country. And part of healthcare dignity and Medicaid was, in fact, your ability as a recipient to be able to choose who your provider was, like where you would get care. And you can imagine that with a backdrop as I've described, how difficult it would be for people who are told, well, you get this benefit through federal legislation, right, through federal enactment, but you must be treated over here at a place in which where you were denied care, where your family members were denied care, where they use language that demeans you, where you're not called by your name, but you're called boy or girl as a grown individual in states like South Carolina, North Carolina, Mississippi, Arkansas, Alabama, that whole Southern belt. And so this was really a point of tremendous dignity to have this element of being able to have provider choice, which then stripped away. And of course, the longer term game and what we see coming out of the recent legislation, the Big Beautiful Bill, has been to target Planned Parenthood and other providers that provide reproductive health care and specifically abortion. The effort is to get rid of any kind of clinic facility that provides reproductive health care to poor Americans. We should make clear for people who are confused that already there was no Medicaid funding that is being used towards abortion at Planned Parenthood or the places like that. It just doesn't happen. That's because of the Hyde Amendment. But what the effort is to do is to make sure that there is no place for poor people, people who are working class, low income people, to be able to go. Now, they might say that it's only about abortion, but it's not just about abortion, because the places that are providing that care, the vast majority of the care that they're providing is non-abortion care. And what a horrific trade-off. If you care and understand about healthcare, what a horrific trade-off to say, well, we're going to put you in a position where the only kind of care that you can give is this other kind of care, knowing very well that people need health care that is associated with pregnancy, that is related to reproductive health care, whether it is for sexually transmitted disease screening, STIs, whether it is for birth control, or whether it is for an abortion. And one of the things that we've seen in the charred earth that has resulted in the wake of Dobbs is that there are many different reasons why someone might need to terminate a pregnancy, including in order to save a life.
I want to thank you so much, Dr. Goodwin, for taking the time to share your expertise, your insights, your perspective. And I wanted to give you an opportunity, if there's anything that you think people need to be really paying attention to, you want to share something that you've been working on, or really anything that you wanted to close with, I wanted to give you the opportunity to do so.
I will just say this. One, I'm so grateful that you invited me on. And two, I think it's really important that we continue to elevate conversation, to be able to be engaged in discourse, because there are efforts to silence it. And so it's really important that we educate and we inform. And of the many things that I could say, as these times go forward, we must not lose hope and we must not lose joy. There are times in which we need to be vigilant, that we really need to fight for the rule of law, for democracy, for each other, for the dignity, to preserve the dignity in each other. And as that happens, it is critically important to keep one's sanity. It's critically important to keep one's joy. And I think that if there's lessons that have been kept from times in which communities have suffered and when they've been able to make it through, they've been able to because they've been able to maintain that part of their human experience.
Thank you so much, Dr. Goodwin.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks for listening to Refuse-Fascism. Your support is urgently needed to get the message of the show and this movement on a whole different level, influencing millions. Donate today at refusefascism.org. Hit the donate button there or text support to 855-755-1314. You can also join our Patreon community at patreon.com/refusefascism, where your support keeps the show going and fighting against this fascist nightmare. Please share this episode far and wide. Rate and review us on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen. Drop a comment on our socials or YouTube. Every share, every word helps build this fight and keeps us going. Of course, you can find us on social media at Refuse-Fascism, including on Blue Sky, and follow us on TikTok at Refuse-Fascism, where fascism is spelled F-A-S-H-I-Z-M. Big thanks to Mark Tinkelman, to Richie Marini, to Lena Thorne for their amazing work producing this show. Until next Sunday, in the name of humanity, we refuse to accept a fascist America.